Grace Holloway stood in the rain clutching white lilies, waiting for the prison gates to open, unaware that Luke Holloway, the man she'd waited 6 years for, would walk out already planning the night she'd never see coming. Grace Holloway had always believed that love could conquer anything. In the small town of Ravenswood, people admired her quiet strength, but pitied the way she wasted it on a man like Luke. They called her foolish behind her back, but she didn't care. To her, loyalty wasn't something you gave up on just because it got hard. And it had gotten very hard. Luke had been the kind of man who made promises with a crooked smile and broke them just as quickly. 6 years earlier, he'd been arrested during a botched armed robbery of a gas station on the outskirts of town. Grace still remembered that night vividly. The knock on her door at 2 in the morning, the officer's grim face in the dim porch light. The words, "We have your husband in custody." Most women would have walked away then, and many told her she should have. But Grace had stood by Luke through the trial, through the sentencing, through the humiliation of hearing neighbors whisper about her in the grocery store. She visited him every single week without fail. She took the long bus ride to the prison, carrying home-cooked meals in plastic containers that the guards always confiscated. She sat across from him in the visitor room and smiled through the glass, pretending she didn't notice the hardened edge growing in his eyes. He barely spoke some days, his gaze dark and distant. Sometimes he wouldn't even pick up the phone on his side of the glass. Still, she showed up. Grace wrote letters to him almost every night. She told him about the town, about Emily's new job at the post office, about how she had painted the kitchen yellow because he'd once said it was his favorite color. She wrote about the stray dog that started sleeping on their porch. She told him she believed in him, that she forgave him, that she was waiting for him. Even when his replies came less and less often, she kept writing. She convinced herself that deep down, he was still the man she'd fallen in love with. The man who used to slip flowers into her locker in high school. The man who once worked 2 jobs to buy her a silver bracelet for Christmas. But sometimes, late at night, when she was alone in their too quiet house, she wondered if she was wrong. Sometimes she lay awake and thought about the look on his face when the judge had read the sentence. Not sadness, not remorse. Something else, something colder. The day of his release, she woke before sunrise, too nervous to eat. She put on her best dress, the navy blue one he'd always liked, and fixed her hair in soft waves. She stood in the bathroom for a long time, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to silence the little voice in her mind that whispered, "What if he's changed? What if you don't know him anymore?" She arrived at the prison gates early, clutching a bouquet of white lilies. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the morning air was sharp and still. Every few minutes she glanced toward the gate, her heart thudding faster each time the heavy steel door creaked open. When Luke finally stepped out, she felt a rush of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. But then he looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something strange in his eyes. Not joy, not even surprise, something else she couldn't quite name, something that made her stomach twist. But then he smiled. That crooked smile she'd fallen in love with all those years ago, and she told herself she was imagining things. She handed him the flowers, and he took them wordlessly. His hands were cold. As they walked to the car, she tried to fill the silence with hopeful chatter. She talked about the house, about how the neighbors had kept the lawn trimmed, about how Emily and Mason were planning to come over that evening to welcome him home. But Luke just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. Grace told herself it didn't matter. He just needed time to adjust, to remember what it felt like to free, to remember who he was before prison had hardened him. She told herself that, over and over. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was different now. And deep down, though she would never say it out loud, she wondered if the man walking beside her was even the same man she had loved all these years, or if that man had been left behind in that prison, never to return. The morning Luke walked out of prison, the air was crisp with the bite of early autumn. The sun rose slowly over the barren hills beyond the state penitentiary, casting long, pale shadows on the cracked pavement where Grace stood waiting. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, clutching the bouquet of white lilies tighter with every passing minute. Each time the heavy metal doors clanged open, her breath hitched, only to release again when it wasn't him. The parking lot was quiet except for the occasional car pulling in and out, families and girlfriends and mothers waiting just like her, all of them holding on to hope for a fresh start. Then finally, Luke appeared. He stepped through the gates in a plain gray hoodie, his head slightly bowed, his hands shoved into his pockets. Grace's heart leapt at the sight of him, a strange mixture of relief and something else, something she couldn't quite place. He didn't run to her, or even smile at first. He just scanned the lot, his eyes glinting under the early light, before settling on her. There was something in his gaze that froze her for just a moment. Not warmth, not gratitude, something sharper. But then just as quickly he smiled, that familiar crooked smile, and the spell broke. She closed the distance between them in seconds and threw her arms around him. He hugged her back stiffly, his hands barely grazing her shoulders before falling back to his sides. Grace told herself it was just the shock of freedom, the adjustment of stepping into a world he hadn't touched in 6 long years. She placed the lilies in his hands and laughed nervously, telling him how much she'd missed him, how proud she was, how happy she was to finally bring him home. Luke nodded silently, glancing down at the flowers like he didn't know what to do with them. On the drive back to town, she filled the quiet with chatter, her words tumbling out in a rush. She told him about the kitchen she'd painted yellow because he'd once said it reminded him of sunlight. She told him about the new grocery store that had opened downtown, about the stray dog that still slept on their porch, about Emily's promotion at the post office. Luke just stared out the window as the miles passed, his expression unreadable. Occasionally he murmured a single word, "Yeah," or "okay." But his voice sounded strange to her, distant and flat. The closer they got to Ravenswood, the heavier the silence became. Grace glanced at him more than once, trying to read the thoughts behind his blank expression. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight. She wanted to ask what he was thinking, but couldn't bring herself to break the quiet. When they pulled into the driveway of their small white-painted house, Grace felt a swell of hope, despite everything. She parked and smiled at him, gesturing toward the front porch where Emily and Mason were already waiting. Emily stood with a nervous smile, waving hesitantly. Mason leaned against the porch railing with his arms crossed, his face hard to read. Grace had invited them both to welcome Luke home, thinking a small gathering of familiar faces might ease him back into the world. As Luke stepped out of the car, Emily's smile faltered slightly. Grace didn't notice at first, but Mason certainly did. His sharp eyes followed Luke's every move as he walked slowly up the path. Grace bounded ahead to unlock the door, her excitement bubbling again as she threw it open and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh paint. Grace had set the dining table with candles and clean linens, a home-cooked meal already warming in the oven. She fussed over every detail, talking about how much he'd loved the roast chicken, how much the house had missed him. Behind her, she didn't see the way Emily watched Luke carefully, the way Mason shot him a faint, almost imperceptible nod as he entered. Grace didn't notice the way Luke's eyes lingered on the kitchen, then the back door, then the hallway as if taking mental inventory. For Grace, this was the beginning of everything she had waited for, the start of a new life she had never stopped believing in. But for Luke, the night was already beginning to take shape in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. His lips curved into a faint, calculated smile as he glanced at Mason, who gave a subtle, knowing smirk in return. Grace couldn't see it yet, but there was something in that silence, something waiting just beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before it showed its face. The first few days after Luke's return were not what Grace had imagined all those years she spent waiting. She had pictured long mornings in bed, quiet afternoons, cooking together, evenings filled with laughter and stories about what they had both endured. Instead, she woke up each morning to find his side of the bed already empty. He was always up before dawn, pacing through the house, standing by the window staring out at the street as if watching for something. At breakfast, he barely touched his food, and when she tried to talk to him, his answers were clipped and vague. He didn't seem angry, exactly, just distant, and his silences weren't the comfortable kind they used to share. These silences felt like walls, tall and cold and impenetrable. Grace told herself to be patient. 6 years was a long time. Maybe he just needed to adjust. But every day, the unease in her chest grew heavier. He started disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. Sometimes he'd leave right after dinner and not come home until almost dawn. She'd sit by the window and wait, her fingers twisting in her lap, imagining all kinds of terrible things that could have happened to him. When he did finally return, his clothes smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something she couldn't quite place, metallic, oily, foreign. He never told her where he'd been. She started to notice how his phone never left his pocket, how he would step outside to take calls and come back in with that same flat, unreadable expression. He didn't ask her about her day anymore. He didn't even seem to notice the little things she did, how she'd ironed his shirts and organized his dresser, how she'd stocked the fridge with all his favorite foods, how she wore that blue dress again because he'd once said it was beautiful on her. One night, after another long, wordless dinner, Grace finally gathered the courage to ask where he was going every night. He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the knob, and turned his head just enough to glance at her. The look he gave her was sharp enough to make her breath catch. Then he simply said, "Don't wait up," and walked out. That night, she stayed awake until nearly 3 in the morning, listening for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. When he finally returned, she heard another set of footsteps trailing behind him. She peeked through the crack of the bedroom door and saw Mason following Luke into the house. The two of them disappeared into the garage, and she heard low voices, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, a metallic clang, and then silence. The next morning, she found the garage locked from the inside. It was Emily who finally voiced what Grace had been too afraid to say. The next day, while visiting over coffee, Emily leaned across the table and whispered, "Something's wrong with him." Grace wanted to deny it, to tell her best friend she was imagining things. But she couldn't. Not when she thought about the way his eyes sometimes flicked toward the back door like he was planning an escape, the way his hands fidgeted in his pockets like he was hiding something he didn't want her to see. Still, Grace defended him. "He just needs time," she said. But when Emily left, Grace stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the garage door, and the thought she'd been avoiding finally slipped through her mind. What if the man who came home to her wasn't really her husband anymore? What if prison hadn't just hardened him? What if it had turned him into someone she didn't even recognize? That night, she lay awake, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as he moved through the house long after midnight. And when she heard the garage door close softly and the faint click of the lock, she felt a chill creep down her spine. Something was happening, something she couldn't yet see, but she could feel it building, gathering, waiting for the right moment to strike. The day had started like any other since Luke's return, quiet, heavy, and tense. He had left the house hours earlier, offering no explanation, just his usual, hollow, "Don't wait up." Grace tried to distract herself by cleaning. She swept and dusted, rearranged the pantry, and even scrubbed the baseboards in the hallway just to keep her hands busy. But no matter how much she cleaned, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at her stomach. By late afternoon the rain was falling steadily, drumming against the windows and soaking the yard outside. Grace wandered into the bedroom, intending to straighten Luke's side of the closet. As she moved his clothes aside, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic in the very back corner. She froze. At first she thought it was just an old toolbox, but when she pulled it out and set it on the bed, she realized it was something else entirely, a small, heavy steel lockbox, the kind that wasn't meant to keep tools but secrets. It rattled faintly when she tilted it. Whatever was inside shifted slightly, scraping against the metal. Her purse quickened as she turned it over in her hands, looking for a way to open it. The lock on the front glinted dully in the gray light. No key anywhere in sight. For a long moment, she just stared at it. A part of her screamed to leave it alone, to put it back where she found it and pretend she'd never seen it. But another part of her, the part that had been quietly watching him grow colder and more secretive by the day, urged her to find out what he was hiding. She placed the box back in the closet and quickly searched his drawers, feeling through his shirts and checking his pants pockets. No key. She even went to the garage door and rattled the knob, but as always, it was locked tight. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her jump. Her heart skipped a beat as she shoved the box back into its hiding place, slid the closet door shut, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Luke walked in a minute later, dripping rainwater onto the floor. He didn't say a word, just nodded at her and disappeared into the bathroom. Grace sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the closet door, half expecting him to storm back in and accuse her of snooping. But he didn't. He just changed clothes and left again, muttering something about meeting Mason. As soon as she heard the car pull away, she hurried back to the closet and pulled out the box again. This time she placed it under the bed, where she could keep an eye on it. That night, sleep didn't come. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the occasional groan of the old house. The box's presence under the bed was impossible to ignore. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined what might be inside: cash, weapons, drugs, papers with names and dates she wouldn't understand. And worse than any of that was the growing certainty that whatever it was meant to stay hidden from her. The next evening, when Luke left yet again, she made up her mind to follow him. She waited a full 5 minutes, after his car disappeared, before grabbing her coat and slipping out into the cold night. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick and shining under the streetlights. She kept her distance, her headlights off whenever she could, trailing his car through town, and then farther out, past the last gas station, past the last cluster of houses, to a lonely stretch of road that led to the abandoned warehouse district. Grace's hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached. She parked a block away, heart hammering, and watched as Luke pulled into the cracked parking lot of one of the derelict buildings. She saw Mason's car already there. They both disappeared inside. No lights came on. Grace sat in the darkness, her breath fogging the windshield, watching the warehouse loom in the distance, like a shadowy secret she wasn't supposed to know. She didn't dare move closer. Not yet. But deep down, she knew. Whatever was inside that box, whatever was happening in that warehouse, those two things were connected, and somehow, some way, it was all going to come back to her. The next morning, Grace sat at the kitchen table long after her coffee had gone cold, staring blankly at the wall. She hadn't slept. Her mind kept replaying what she'd seen the night before: the warehouse's crumbling silhouette against the dark sky, the two men vanishing inside without hesitation, the feeling in her chest like a knot tightening with every passing second. She couldn't shake the image of Luke's face when he'd come home hours later. There had been something in his eyes when he walked through the door, something satisfied, almost triumphant. He hadn't noticed her watching him from the shadows of the hallway. He'd tossed his jacket carelessly over a chair and gone straight to bed, leaving muddy footprints across her freshly mopped floor. By mid-afternoon, she could stand it no longer. She called Emily. Emily showed up within 10 minutes, her expression already clouded with worry. Grace hesitated, but finally told her everything about the lockbox she'd found, about following Luke to the warehouse, about the men meeting in the dark. Emily didn't interrupt, though her hands tightened around her teacup with every word. When Grace finally fell silent, Emily leaned forward and whispered, "You need to find out what he's doing, Grace, before it's too late." The idea lodged in her mind, and refused to leave. That night, when Luke left as usual, Grace grabbed her coat and keys without even thinking, but Emily stopped her at the door. "Let me do it," she said. "You can't follow him again. If he sees you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the warning hung in the air between them. Grace relented, and Emily promised to keep her updated. Hours passed. Grace sat by the phone, her heart leaping every time it rang, only for it to be a wrong number, or dead silence on the other end. Finally, near midnight, Emily called. Her voice was low, urgent. "I saw him," she said, "and Mason, and someone else." Grace pressed the receiver to her ear, her pulse roaring in her head. "They met a man behind the warehouse," Emily continued. "Tall, dark jacket, scar on his cheek. I think he handed them something. A gun." Grace's breath hitched. "I stayed far back," Emily added. "I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Luke gave him money. A lot of money." Grace's knees felt weak. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't even form into words. When Luke came home hours later, she tried to act normal. But as he brushed past her in the hallway, she caught the faint metallic scent of gun oil clinging to his clothes, sharper now, unmistakable. The next day, when she slipped into the garage while he was upstairs, she found a single black glove on the workbench and an empty box of ammunition tucked behind a crate of tools. The locked cabinet in the corner was still closed, but she was certain now what it contained. That evening, Emily came by again, her face pale. "I did some asking around," she whispered. "The man with the scar, his name's Darren Cole. He's known in town. Arms dealer, dangerous." Grace felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. The man she had waited for all those years, the man she had believed could change, was still keeping the worst kind of company. And worse, whatever Luke was planning, he was planning it with Mason and Darren. Grace stared out the kitchen window as the sun set, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She couldn't help but wonder, was the gun meant for someone else, or was it meant for her? That thought stayed with her all night, long after Luke had slipped out into the darkness again, and the faint echo of her front door clicking shut left her shivering in her own home. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried the chill of a storm that hadn't quite passed. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, staring at her reflection in the window as she washed the same dish over and over again. Her hands trembled, though she tried to convince herself it was just the cold. She kept thinking about the gun Emily had seen, the money exchanged, the way Luke's eyes had looked sharper, harder every night he came home. She had to know what he was planning. That afternoon, she went through the house again while Luke was gone. Every drawer, every cabinet, even under the loose floorboard in the hall where he used to hide his cigarettes. But nothing. The locked box was still wedged in the closet where she'd left it. Whatever secrets it held, she still didn't have the key. She thought about breaking it open, but as her fingers hovered over the lock, she froze. Something deep in her gut told her that once she opened it, there'd be no going back. That evening, she made a choice. If Luke was planning something, she would force him to stay home and face her. She cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken, garlic potatoes, fresh bread, and lit candles on the table. She put on the blue dress he used to love, pinned her hair back neatly, and set out the good dishes. He came home just after sunset, his steps heavy on the porch. When he opened the door, she greeted him with a bright smile that felt brittle on her face. "Dinner's ready," she said softly, gesturing to the table. For a moment, Luke stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing slightly as they swept over the room. Then his mouth curved into that crooked smile. "Looks nice," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. They sat down to eat, the sound of forks scraping plates loud in the quiet room. Grace talked about small things, the weather, Emily's visit, a new neighbor who'd moved in down the street, but he barely responded, his mind clearly elsewhere. When Mason's truck headlights cut across the window, Luke's chair scraped back sharply. "Don't go," Grace blurted before she could stop herself. Her voice cracked the silence, even she flinched at how desperate it sounded. Luke froze at the door, glancing back at her over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw tightened as Mason honked the horn outside. Without a word, he walked out and slammed the door behind him. Grace's hands shook as she sat back down at the table. The food on her plate had gone cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move. 15 minutes later, her phone buzzed on the counter. She snatched it up. Emily. Her friend's voice was low, urgent. "They're at the warehouse again," she said. "But this time, Grace, I think something's about to happen. Mason brought a duffel bag, and Luke, he looks different tonight. Worse." Grace's breath hitched. Emily continued, "I heard them say your name." That stopped her cold. Her name. She gripped the counter with white-knuckled hands, staring at the garage door as if she could see straight through it. The thought struck her, sharp and clear. Whatever Luke was planning, it wasn't just dangerous, it was personal. She hung up without saying goodbye and stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Then, almost in a trance, she walked back to the bedroom. She knelt at the closet and pulled out the locked box, setting it on the bed in front of her. Her fingers rested on the cold steel as she whispered to herself, "What are you hiding from me?" But in the back of her mind, a darker thought was already taking shape. What if she didn't want to know? What if some things were better left locked away? Outside, the faint echo of another car door slamming shut made her flinch. Something was coming. And this time, she wasn't sure she'd be ready when it arrived. Morning came heavy and gray, a thick fog rolling in over Ravenswood like a shroud. Grace sat on the edge of the bed long after the sun had risen, staring down at her hands. They were trembling again. She couldn't stop them anymore. Sleep hadn't come to her at all. She'd spent the entire night listening to the faint creaks of the house, every little sound making her flinch, imagining that at any moment Luke might return and find her awake. But he never did. When she finally went into the kitchen, she found muddy footprints across the linoleum. They trailed from the back door through the hallway to the bedroom, then stopped as though he'd cleaned them up after. The sight of them made her stomach knot. She'd never known him to come in through the back door. She crouched and traced a finger through one of the prints. The mud was dark and thick, mixed with something darker still, red-brown, dried into the grooves of his boot tread. Her phone buzzed on the counter, making her jump. Emily's name lit up the screen. When she answered, Emily didn't waste time. Her voice was tense, barely above a whisper. "You need to call the police," she said. Grace swallowed hard, clutching the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Why?" "Because," Emily said, pausing as though even saying it aloud was dangerous. "I went back to the warehouse this morning. I don't think they know I was there." "Grace, there was blood on the floor. A lot of it. And drag marks." Grace felt her knees go weak. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. Emily's words came faster now, her panic bleeding through. "Something happened last night. I heard Mason and Luke arguing outside before they left. They said something about finishing the plan, and then I saw them carry something heavy out of the warehouse and put it in Mason's truck. They covered it with a tarp." Grace shut her eyes, the image flashing in her mind. A tarp. Blood. Her voice was little more than a whisper. "What did they do?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I think you're next." Those words hit her like a slap. She hung up without saying goodbye, her heart hammering, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For a long time she stood there staring at nothing, feeling the weight of everything closing in. Then she moved. Her hands worked quickly, almost on instinct, throwing open drawers, checking the closet, searching every corner of the house. She found nothing, not the key to the lockbox, not a single clue to what was inside. But when she finally knelt in the garage and pried open the locked cabinet, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, resting on a shelf, was a sleek black pistol. Next to it sat a small box of ammunition, half empty. She stood, holding the gun in both hands, and stared at it. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Who was Luke planning to use it on? And why had Emily said she was next? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted her from her thoughts. She scrambled to hide the gun back in the cabinet, slamming it shut just as the front door creaked open. Luke stepped inside, his boots echoing on the floor. His jacket was damp, his face unreadable. He stopped in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at her. For a long moment, Neither of them spoke. Then he smiled that familiar, crooked smile. But this time, it didn't reach his eyes. Grace felt her stomach twist as he set a single white lily on the counter, its petals still wet from the fog. Her own voice sounded strange to her as she finally spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "Where have you been?" But Luke only looked at her, his smile steady, his silence more terrifying than any answer he could have given. Something was coming, and she knew deep down it was already too late to stop it. The sky that evening was painted in streaks of deep crimson and violet, the last rays of sunlight casting eerie hairy across the small white house. Grace stood at the kitchen window, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as she watched the world grow darker. The white lily Luke had left earlier lay on the table behind her, its petals already beginning to curl. Her mind raced as she tried to piece everything together. The box she still couldn't open, the gun hidden in the garage, the whispers about finishing the plan, the blood Emily had seen on the warehouse floor, and the most chilling of all, Emily's panicked words that morning, "I think you're next." Every sound in the house seemed louder now. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the steady drum of her own heartbeat in her ears. The front door creaked open. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Luke stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light outside. He stepped inside slowly, shutting the door behind him without a word. He hung his damp jacket on the hook and turned to look at her. For the briefest moment, she almost believed everything would be all right, that she had imagined it all, that this was still the man she'd waited 6 long years for. But then she saw the look in his eyes, cold, calculating, final. He walked past her without speaking, his boots heavy on the floorboards. She followed him down the hall, her breath shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. He stopped at the bedroom door, glanced over his shoulder at her, and smirked faintly before disappearing inside. Something inside her finally broke. Quietly she slipped to the garage, her feet silent on the concrete. She crouched in front of the locked cabinet, her fingers working at the latch until it gave way. She pulled the gun from its shelf, her hands trembling as she checked the safety, just like her father had taught her years ago. Then she stood, clutching it tightly, and made her way back to the bedroom. The door was ajar. She could hear him moving inside. She pushed it open slowly. Luke was standing with his back to her, the lockbox on the bed in front of him. He had found the key. It lay next to the open lid. Inside the box, she saw stacks of cash, a passport, a one-way plane ticket, and another gun. This one sleek and silver. Her blood ran cold. He picked up the silver gun, turning it over in his hands, and spoke without turning around. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. He finally turned, the silver gun hanging loosely at his side. "This was never about you, Grace," he said softly, almost pitying. "You were just convenient." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. His lips curved into that same crooked smile she'd once loved. But before he could raise his weapon, the front door burst open. Voices shouted. Heavy boots thundered down the hall. In an instant, armed officers swarmed the bedroom, their guns trained on Luke. Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Drop it, Luke," one of the officers barked. For the first time, Luke's mask of calm faltered. He glared at Grace, his eyes full of venom, then dropped the gun to the floor. They dragged him away in handcuffs, his silence more damning than any confession. The house fell quiet again, except for Emily's shaky breath as she pulled Grace into her arms. Later, the police showed her the evidence Emily had gathered. Warehouse security footage, phone records, even a written plan naming Grace as the intended victim, so Luke could inherit her life insurance and flee the country. Standing alone in the bedroom afterward, Grace stared down at the open box, its contents a cruel reminder of how close she had come to dying at the hands of the man she'd loved most. And though he was gone now, she couldn't shake the feeling that his shadow would haunt her forever.